In this Silky Pix video, I will demonstrate how to adjust and master the exposure using the histogram. Start by selecting the image that will be edited, then go to the Parameters controls, and in the set of icons, select the development setting, the one at right on top, and click to open the panel. Within the rounded square line is where it's integrated the color space from top to bottom. The first is for the input color, the format of the file that we are going to edit, which is defined by the option made in the camera to capture the image. The next option is for the output color. Placing the cursor over the profile name and click opens a small menu created by the software with the profiles of color spaces. The better way to choose them is to perceive them through the histogram. Alternating between them, there's a slight change that occurs due to one be bigger than other. The RGB profile will make us edit with the smallest space, while using the Adobe, the bigger. This lets us questioning, why use the small space if we can use the bigger, as we are editing, and these options can be reversed at the end of the adjustment on batch development. In my case, opted for the Adobe was the logical choice to take advantage of the bigger color space. And to complete the configuration, which is to choose the way the software work. On the profile and color representation, I'm using the default, which is associated with the choice to get their true and natural colors. After comes something that isn't normally mentioned. However, I need to talk. What is a tool and what is a function? All of this is to perceive its differences, to know how these work and how to use them. Just like the tool, also, the function shares the value in common but differently. While the tool changes the values along a scale, the function works with only one value that can be any one of these used by the tool. This reveals that it's the tool that creates the function. Also is much easier to be recognized, cause is normally identified having a slider attached. By contrary, the function is more imperceptible. If it is created, can be identified, otherwise will continue to operate as a reference. An example of a tool is the exposure bias, which is identified placing the cursor over its slider. In opposite, the functions are more imperceptible. At first sight, we have the display warnings example that already has some identified functions. To have mentioned all of this has a purpose, but before that, I need to change some aspects that will help us in this process. One of them is to replace the things that we don't have in common by those that are truly equal. This is to do something that goes beyond anything you may already have seen before, which to center the histogram on the screen to hide the image. This is something that isn't truly necessarily to do. I only want to show this way of setting the exposure, which is to use the histogram instead of the details of an image. Although Silky Pix gives us multiple ways to do this, for now I will only teach the easiest and more accessible. Now, in addition, a new perspective was created that change our point of view, which is the way we see an adjustment, and the best way I found to show you is to interpret how my eyes see. Looking at the histogram, this is how normally it's presented to us. A graphic with a form of 3 RGB channels. Imagine that the histogram is a box, and the RGB channels a paper sheet that every time is placed inside of this supposed box, the histogram, it fills and fits perfectly all space on its interior. Imagine someone giving us the same paper but this time crumpled, deformed. What we would do to place it in the box with the same form and characteristics to fill and fit perfectly again. The normal tendency would be to grab in the paper, stretch it with the fingers and smooth with the palm of the hands to obtain the form again to fill and fit perfectly. That is the same principle that we're going to use here, with the difference replacing the hands by the tools. As the RGB channels are already inside, the effect of grab or extract will be replaced by the movement effect. Also, we need to have in mind that when something fails, something that should be there will be now missing. This can be perceived in the form of RGB channels that seem to us not enough. What we're going to do is make it grow, stretch it, and with no references of what exactly is missing, fill it. For that, we're going to use the only tool that can produce the effect of stretching, the contrast tool, which will be the first tool that we're going to use. We also must have in mind that, when a fill effect is being produced, it should have no values to prevent it. This way, the first thing to do is look at the form of RGB channels that seems too small than the length of the histogram and stretch it. Make it grow to fill it. For that, using the contrast tool to place on the value of 2.50, which is the highest normal point. After this, use the contrast center tool. Decrease all the values do not influence and to complete the effect of filling. In the next step will be to use what was mentioned about the tools. For that I will remember that the tool can create a function. Also, it uses all the values of a tool scale that are at the same time references. So, what we're going to do is take advantage of the characteristics of a tool to push all this form of channels to the highlights. For that, we're going to use the gamma tool. Why this tool? Because it works exactly with the entire form of the RGB channels at the same time. To perceive its effect, we can use the slider along the values of the tool scale. Raising all the values and keep the gamma tool at the highest point creates a reference. And even not seeming enough to fill the length is on the right position to use the last tool, which is naturally the exposure bias tool. To set, use it had in mind to center the RGB channels in the histogram. So, use the exposure tool to adjust, and when the RGB channels seem to you that is positioned at the center of the histogram, stop and balance this without worry about the precision. At this point, the main process will be complete. All we have to do now is to reverse, using the same method of centering the RGB channels. First, we use the gamma tool. As we know that everything is filled and nothing will overflow, we should not worry and make the tool dynamic, taking advantage of its characteristics to give more or less of something that seems missing. The same can be said about the contrast and contrast center tool, using them as preferences with small adjustments. After this, I only wish to add and say that, when we use the histogram to set, it also reveal our failures. This can be great for us to learn and grow if we know to accept them well. In this part, and using the first image, I tried to gather the aspects with my examples to give you the reasons why things are made. Imagine filling a cup with many different portions of a liquid. Sometimes we can make it overflow using only one. So, filling it first with all, we can now remove the portions without worry if it will overflow. This is the thought I used to do this. This way, I take this opportunity to use another image to simplify all of this. When you have a doubt, the exposure fails or any other reason, all you have to do is this. Open the image that you want to set the exposure. On control panels, go over to the development settings icon and click to open a panel. Without forget that now you are editing. Select the name of the output color space and click to open the menu. Choosing the RGB will make you editing with the small color space, while that with the Adobe is the bigger. Choose your preference. In my case is the Adobe. Next, and act always like this, as we don't have any references, and without worrying about the image condition, use the contrast tool to make the form of RGB channels stretch. For that, move the slider into the value 2.50, which is the highest normal point of the tool. Believing that some of you may already have discovered that we can go beyond this value, my advice is to do that, but only when you will know what you're doing to take advantage of it. Continuing, and to have no influences on the set of the form, use the slider of the contrast center tool, and decrease all the values. This completes the effect of stretch and fill. After, we will use the gamma tool to push all the form of channels into the highlights to create a reference. So, use the slider and raise the value to 1.70 to mark the reference. Then use the exposure tool and look at the same time to the histogram to center all the form of RGB channels. There's no need to be precise. With the same principle in mind, to center, complete the process of adjustment. For that, take advantage of the characteristics of the gamma tool and make it dynamic. The contrast and contrast center tool should be used with small adjustments. At this moment that the process of setting the exposure is almost complete. Just for curiosity, inputting any value of any tool will not cause any strange effect. All other possible adjustments we can use the preferences and the micro adjustments. The most important, for now, was to show how to use the histogram to overcome the challenges of the exposure, and to end with the doubts, because there's nothing worse than when we open an image and we don't know what to do or where to start with. This is something that you can use before any other adjustment or doubt, and is exclusively yours, cause you are the true owner of the form of RGB channels. Besides, you are no longer depending on a specific detail of an image to decide. Thanks for watching. See you soon.